live streaming event. The topic is to do with education, inequality, and innovation in the time of COVID. It is theme 9 in the JET initiation of an education bootcamp research project about the impact of COVID on education in South Africa. It started off small, and it has now then grew like Topsy to 12 different themes. And this one is theme 9. So my task now, having welcomed you, is to introduce myself, Rubina Parker, and Katherine Morris as the 3 main writers of this report. The first thing I must say is that my role has been quite a mixed one in this research project. I was brought on as a reviewer initially, and then as time was marching on relentlessly, I then became a co-writer and then ultimately the content editor, trying to smooth and pull together the many different research inputs that this team had produced over time. And that's the background to my role in this. My CV, well, it's nearly 50 years of a career that I've had in education. And looking back, I've been many different things, from teacher, educator, evaluator, public policy analyst, involved in that role from the 1990s in public policy research. And then after my PhD in policy studies in the early 90s, I was involved in the National Education Crisis Committee task teams in preparation for a new system of education under the ANC government. I've worked in both the public and the private or independent education sectors here. And as CEO of ISASA, the Independent Schools Association of Southern Africa, I've been an education program manager of many different NGO policy units. And I'm now, of course, back as an independent consultant and JET associate, as an education and public policy analyst. And in my time since my retirement from ISASA, I've been involved in a number of JET's big research projects for my SIN's large and complex literature reviews, and particularly in the areas of TVET and teacher policy, many different aspects of teacher policy. I think what drew me to this research in particular, and other pieces of important South African education research, is that what has always interested me is getting to the roots, the nature of education issues and their scale and scope in all their complexity, to make sense of them. Interestingly, I was thinking that my very first publication was probably on inequality in South African education, and here I am as part of a team investigating that again. Well, the main lead researcher of this project was Rubina Parker. She is a lawyer and researcher. She currently works as senior researcher at Equal Education Law Centre, at Public Interest Law Clinic, which is well known now in South Africa in education and other circles. This specializes in education policy, legal advocacy, community lawyering, and public interest litigation to advance the struggle for equal and quality education. Rubina completed her articles and practiced as an attorney at Weber Wenzel during 2018. She has developed specialist skills in the areas of constitutional administrative law and has been involved in various public interest litigations. Katherine is our other co-writer and author. She is a PhD student and project coordinator based at Stellenbosch University Water Institute. Now, this shows how many of the researchers come from different backgrounds, but are gripped by what this pandemic means for education. She's midway through a joint PhD between Stellenbosch University and Coventry University in the UK, with her research focusing on public policy. After a number of years tutoring undergraduate students across several departments, she joined the Water Institute, where the bulk of her research has been in the post-school education space, specifically the TVET sector. Well, that now provides some of the context about us. But what else can we give as background to this particular piece of research? Well, it took place in a constantly shifting and fluid context as the effects of COVID widened, deepened, and disrupted education and training, and especially schooling. The impact of the virus on schooling, what action should be taken, have produced vigorous debate, politicized battle lines, new medical research and findings about the virus, and highly contested actions, for example, around the opening and closing of schools, and the effects on teachers. What interested us, and in fact made this research challenging, is that we really have investigated in our research very topical and relevant issues, which continue to be debated. There's hardly a day that doesn't pass with another article being written relevant to our research. And as different groups, unions, parents, education departments, governing body associations, pediatricians, epidemiologists, educationists, and economists all weighing in as the terrain kept shifting. This did increase the challenges we faced. So that's the background, in a brief way, to the nature of this research and the context in which we did it. Of course, the burning question in any research is, what motivated you to pursue the research? Why, Rubeena and Katherine, do you think it was important to examine the intersection between education, inequality, and innovation in the light of COVID? Rubeena, I'm going to ask you to look at that question first.
Thanks, Jane. When COVID-19 really descended on South Africa, we entered one of the strictest lockdowns that would happen anywhere in the world. And soon after that, schools closed. Immediately, 13 million learners were affected. And what we saw quite early was this pandemic really laying bare the inequalities in society and putting a really unflattering spotlight on the tremendous challenges that are being faced in the education system and in the education sector. And we were very quickly reminded and very rudely awakened again to this reality that we're actually operating in two separate education systems. One which is entirely characterized by schools populated, adequately resourced, I should say, adequately capacitated, where teachers are qualified and where they're not teaching in overcrowded classrooms. And then we're dealing with another system in which the majority of our schools fall and which affect predominantly poor and Black learners, where the opposite is true and where they are under-resourced, under-capacitated, learn in very crowded classrooms and often with teachers who are not necessarily adequately qualified to teach them. And in light of these disparities, we immediately saw really critical questions being raised in the media all around us about how teaching and learning would continue. And what occurred to us was that given these two systems and the gaping hole between them, or the huge gap between them, that those questions needed to go beyond just teaching and learning. For the poorest learners, questions around food and where they would get their next meal were also relevant. And if learning was to continue at home for any space of time, which, as we'll discuss later, may well be a reality, how would they continue to learn at home in spaces that are not necessarily conducive to learning, that are not socially, physically, and emotionally safe spaces for them? And in response to these questions, we saw in the media terms and being discussed and bandied about terms like innovation, innovative technologies, online learning, and I can go on and on, that were just frequently invoked as almost simple solutions to these really insurmountable problems. And we stopped and paused, and maybe it was, whoever was really discussing the theme at the time and coming up with the theme, having, my background at the Equal Education Law Center, it occurred to us that we needed to pause and stop and ask ourselves, firstly, what is the role of technology and innovation really? What could its potential role be in light of these inequalities? Of course, not only were these terms used, but they were also used as a way of saying that this was an opportunity to reimagine the entire education system and that we must capitalize on this opportunity. And then, of course, talks of the fourth industrial revolution were ramped up again, and that narrative was brought to the forefront by government and others again. And we asked ourselves, we thought it was a moment to take pause and ask, is it possible to really do that in light of all these inequalities that I've spoken about? And I'll maybe just pause there for a little, and Katherine can elaborate on some of the questions that we asked ourselves before engaging this research. But the intersection of inequality and innovation was really what interested us and what we wanted to discover.
Katherine, your input.
Thanks, Jane and Rubeena. Initially, I think from myself, the sheer volume of research and outputs and op-eds and think pieces that was sort of flooding the system as we were carrying out this research, where we were seeing two sides of a story. On the one hand, as Rubeena, you pointed out, we're being asked to reimagine this education system and to embrace the fourth industrial revolution and all this emphasis on online learning and the endless possibilities. And on the other hand, all of this information coming in about the actual extent of those inequalities and deep-rooted and old inequalities, not things that COVID-19 had necessarily given rise to, but that COVID-19 had made worse. Obviously, nutrition being one of the primary issues. So with all this evidence sort of pouring in, we really had to ask what is possible, and in terms of that context, specifically, what should innovation look like, and how should we go about embracing that? So those are the questions, that we really sat with when trying to tackle this project. And it was, as Jane pointed out earlier, quite difficult because of how fast the various debates were moving. So that really was a challenge for us to try and pin down those discussions.
I think the key thing that you kept reminding us about, Katherine, was that our research should provide practical, implementable solutions and recommendations, which we have really sought to provide in the research report, which, by the way, is available on the JET website. Say a little bit more about what you think are the three most important things we came up with, Katherine. In terms of those guiding principles.
Thank you. So yes, once we had all this, information, we had to try and distill that and really break it down to its essence. So we came up with three guiding principles, and the first being do no harm. Obviously, a principle familiar to the humanitarian aid sector. The idea that we'll first do no harm, don't do damage. The second being to get the basics right, work on the foundations, and third, to build back better. So those are the three principles that we use to outline our approach.
And we'll come back to those later on. But we were extremely grateful that we could distill it down to those three guiding principles, which we felt would help to guide practical steps. Now, the research process. The researchers listening will want to know how we came to the conclusions and the findings and the guiding principles that we did come to. So, Rubeena, could you tell us a bit more about the form that the research took, the methodologies?
Yes, I think it's really important to mention at the outset that the team behind this report, the team was a lot bigger than this to start out with, and it was made up of a group of 10 researchers from various professional and academic backgrounds, and also very different experience levels. Many were young, really inspiring researchers who, for the first time, were working on a project like this. And so the report is really a culmination of the discussions and the ideas that were shared during those times and those preliminary meetings. And ultimately, we adopted a qualitative research approach. We combined desktop research with the results of online surveys, really to gauge the impact of the pandemic and remote and to gain insight into how teachers, learners, parents, and or caregivers were experiencing the pandemic, including their experiences of remote learning, but also the support that they were receiving during this time, as well as to get a sense of the learning environments that they were operating in. The surveys were administered online and in some limited cases telephonically. And we had quite a big survey sample size, which was very useful and which yielded quite helpful results. There were 444 respondents, of which 76 were learner responses, 275 I think were were parent and or caregiver responses, and there was about 76 and 93 educator responses. They included multiple choice questions, but also open-ended questions, which really were designed to really get a sense of people's real experiences of the pandemic. It is worth noting in relation to the sample that because of the nature of the research and in that it had happened in a very short space of time, the interviews had to be conducted very quickly, and that it had happened on an online platform, that of course we didn't reach the entire population and the most rural populations, and we really didn't reach the poorest, and so the sample isn't representative of the entire population. That said, the broad concerns and the emergent themes that arose and that presented themselves were really reflected and supported by our desktop findings, and they were useful. And very quickly, our desktop research included an analysis of local and international responses by governments, NGOs, and the private sector to school closures and remote learning needs. And we also looked historically at, again, locally and internationally, at responses to other pandemics or other similar emergency or crisis situations in structuring a first draft of the report.
And as I recall, many checks on the latest government regulations.
Correct, which were ever changing.
Yeah, absolutely. But at the same time, recognizing what a momentous task government faced, the DBE faced, the PEDS, because this was a totally unanticipated event. And we were not prepared for a disaster of these proportions. So to do anything and in this time is extremely difficult, and hard decisions had to be made. I think the other thing is our research was time-bound. We had to call a stop. We thought it would be 1st June, then it became 8th June, and then, we said, no, we simply can't read anything more. So all the listeners must please understand, things have happened since we concluded the research part of this report. The rest of the time was spent fixing, cleaning up, refining the report before it came out. I think one of the key things that we would like to put on the table are some of the key observations that emerged in the research. I always remember the renowned evaluator and public policy analyst on research utilization, Carol Weiss at Harvard University, said to me, good research always involves surprises. If your research produces no surprises, you should be worried. And we definitely were surprised. So I thought perhaps, Katherine, you could tell us a bit about what struck us early on in doing the research.
Thanks, Jane. And if I might, Rubeena, please do jump in as we go along. The key surprises that we found, I think that the first and the most important one is that schools are more than just centres of learning. The support structures provided to many children from their schools, aside from basics like daily meals, we're talking about social welfare support, we're talking about places of safety, and for younger learners, also hugely important in terms of their development. Schools are really important ecosystems. So when we look at the innovation, education and inequality question in South Africa, we need to place schools into that context. They're not just places of learning. So that's the first one.
Rubeena, would you like to say something next about hunger as one of the greatest?
I mean, before coming to that, I think I should just add to Katherine's point about schools and really the role that they play, and very timely that a judgment just last Friday came out dealing particularly with school nutrition, and in response to a challenge to the DBE having stalled the rollout of the national school nutrition program. And the judge in that case saying quite expressly, of course, in the context of nutrition, but more broadly, that schools are critical point of contact for reaching vulnerable children. I'll just quickly, quote, and he's saying that there are no other state services that can connect with children on such scale and with such regularity. So I thought that was just really timely and really supports that observation that we make, that comes out very clearly through our survey results, very clearly through our desktop results, and is very important when we have to consider within the parameters of those three guiding principles that Katherine set out above, what innovation, if it is going to be embodied and if it is going to be used, what it needs to achieve. It also needs to understand that schools in the South African context are not just places of learning. They're far more important. And of course, I mean, I think this is what you were alluding to. It's also happening against the backdrop of really increasing hunger, increasing poverty. The statistics on this have been, I mean, the international statistics have been coming out thick and fast, and just recently and I always forget the very long name, but I'm going to call it by its abbreviation, in the very recent NIDS-CRAMS survey, which surveyed over 7,000 South Africans. The statistics there is just alarming, and maybe for purposes of our discussion, just to point out that it states that child hunger, for example, has since 2018 doubled, that 1 in 7 children go hungry, and that in households, about 47% of households by the end of April had run out of food, and are now at that stage we're going hungry. And there are many more statistics which we can quote, which are equally shocking. And just against that backdrop, I think the questions that we're asking are particularly important, and that the solutions that we come up with don't aggravate or exacerbate those realities, and rather account for them.
Thank you. I think you've covered some very important things. Of course, the other key thing was that struck us is, what does remote learning mean in practice, in reality? What does remote learning as the main tool that government is using during the lockdown and school closures? What does that mean? Perhaps you'd like to come in there, Katherine. Is that something that you would like to speak about?
Absolutely. Thanks, Jane. So, yeah, one of the things that didn't come as a surprise as such, but something that's definitely been very important to point out, is that the kind of teaching that's taking place at the moment, so obviously it's not normal. This is not business as usual. It's referred to as emergency remote teaching, or ERT, and that's one of the terms we use very frequently in the report. And that this is basically it's a kind of teaching that is meant to be temporary, and it usually occurs in times of emergency or major crisis, like a natural disaster, for example. That's the kind of situation where emergency remote teaching takes place. And what that is, it's like a stopgap measure to continue teaching that would be delivered face-to-face in normal circumstances, but that can no longer be delivered that way. So it has to be done remotely. And there are various kinds of remote teaching, obviously implying distance. So you have, technology-based solutions, and then tech-based solutions, and then sometimes lower tech solutions like radio or television or something that can be used. So yeah, that's the emergency remote response.
We decided to use remote learning as the generic throughout our research, and but with that underpinning that it's an emergency response, which is rather different from a school system that already had blended learning, well-prepared curricula that they could easily put into an online space. But going back to you, Rubeena, what did we learn from the research about the home and schooling environments of the children who were meant to be, learning remotely?
I mean, certainly what was reflected in our survey findings was that, again, coming back to the point about what kind of spaces schools would typically provide for learners. It was not just about, of course, the digital divide has been spoken about extensively by many other researchers, making it, for obvious reasons, very difficult for the poor and vulnerable and those without access to learn remotely and through technology-enabled means. But beyond that, learning environments also require that children be fed, and we've touched on nutrition. They also require that children be physically safe, that they be safe from trauma, and that they be supported. And what came across quite clearly, whether it was purely by children indicating that they simply didn't have a quiet space to learn, that they were being distracted by their siblings, or that they needed to share a very small space or share resources that they didn't have. They simply didn't have the time to learn. They didn't have someone there who could, even if they had access to online materials, they didn't necessarily have anyone there who could help them use those materials if they needed it. So there were a whole confluence of factors, and all of which compounded, which make up this environment that we're talking about, that goes way beyond just learning.
Indeed. And I think what I realized throughout the research, and people will see in our report, we were at pains to put the context of the South African society in as the backdrop to all of this, because you simply can't talk about equal education in a very unequal society. And the link with that is that you can't actually get remote learning right when there is no basic infrastructure in so many areas of South Africa to even be able to get accessible, affordable connectivity in any form. So unless that basic infrastructure is there, and that whole issue has affected, of course, the whole issue about returning to schools and reopening. With schools, as Equal Education knows only too well, Rubeena, being unable to provide a minimum set of learning conditions. Many schools unable to do that, never mind during the time of COVID, and what it would require to make schools safe places for teachers and children and other staff at schools when they return to schools. I mean, there are some worrying statistics that most South Africans possibly are not aware of, or they are aware of, but could well be reminded. Would you like to tell us some of those, Rubeena?
Well, I mean, I just like to pick up on a couple of things that you said, which have really stuck out and which are important to mention and really form the bedrock of how we, really the genesis of our 3 guiding principles. The first one, you will remember Katherine saying, is first, do no harm, and that is, don't exacerbate existing inequalities by policies and procedures that don't take into account lived realities. But the second one is get the basics right, and that is possibly and one of the most important steps, and without which there really is no foundation on which to build. And lots of researchers and educationists have made the point. I know. I can mention a few, but I know many have made the point that without the basics, and we are talking the very basics, we're talking sanitation, water and electricity, safe structures, physical structures, toilets. Without those basics, what are we taking? What opportunity are we capitalizing on? The talk of reimagining an education system assumes that we have at least a working foundation on which to build before we can capitalize on any existing opportunities. But the reality is that the base is broken. And in fact, there is no foundation or solid foundation on which to build. So, introducing innovative elements into a space that is broken is potentially dangerous. I think that's possibly one of the biggest learnings from this entire process.
Absolutely. And particularly if you go to learning itself, I think Nick Taylor has made this point, Ursula Hoadley has made this point, amongst others, that the youngest children, those early grades, are 1, 2, and 3, the foundation grades. Those, the young learners do not return to school and get at least literacy and numeracy consolidated, there is no learning platform for the future. You've got to learn to read, and then you've got to read to learn for the rest of your life. And unless that is attended to, we're in deep trouble for the next generation of school children. So people have advised that they at least be allowed to return to school above all other grades, because they simply have to learn in a more interactive way. They can't really easily learn from the internet. They can't read yet, and their attention span is not great. So going back to basics also means getting the basics of learning attended to at the very least during the pandemic. I think what struck me so clearly is that we didn't know it at the time, but this whole issue of school closures and reopenings has become now one of the most contested areas of debate in the country. I
think we had inklings, but we didn't realize it.
Realize the extent, and it's become an absolute flashpoint. Now, just to see, are there some things we want to particularly talk about under our key observations? And there, Rubeena, maybe you can come in. What are some of the key observations that we made? We have talked about quite a few of them, but yes. What would you like to highlight? You and Katherine. Feel free to come in, Katherine.
I think we have covered a lot of it. And again, I think if anything is worth emphasizing, it really is the intersection, and I think I've used this term before in our internal discussions, but this triangulation of, where innovation must meet the reality of inequality in the education context. So we've said a number of times in this conversation that, the state of education is reflected and mirrored in the state of our society. But really understanding that whilst they are mirrors to each other, what happens in a society and what's happening in the education system is also just has compounding effects. So not only are learners hungry, not only are they living in households where the income has drastically been reduced with all the implications that come there, but they're also having to learn in a system that is inherently weak. And in our research, we refer to a lot of the research of others talking about what some of the really strong binding, there's a term that economists at the University of Stellenbosch have coined in their research. They refer to binding constraints, and they list a good, key cornerstone constraints facing the education system, including the qualification of teachers, including the fact that a lot of time spent in the classroom is wasted and it's not actually doesn't actually translate into learning, teaching and learning. Which, of course, if that's not happening in the classroom, the question arises: how much of more time is being lost when we're being forced to learn remotely? And there are some others. We mentioned the issue of basic conditions not being in place, and all of those things really compounding into what is a very complex problem for education in this country. And our paper, of course, whilst we really try to provide very practical recommendations and recommendations in the context of the time in which we wrote them. So in an area which is constantly evolving and when new information is being, always becoming available. Those three principles that we came up with are really, what we're really saying is that in light of that reality, in light of sort of the poorest conditions, we really need to think before we simply talk about innovation. And I think we're leading into a discussion of innovation now. And for me, that was important when we tackled that question.
Yes, I think we'll move to Katherine then for her to explain what we had to delve into. So what is innovation? People use it all the time. What does it mean? What can it mean? But before we do that, I do think there's one other key thing that research discovered, and it's to do back with schools as much bigger than centers of learning, or much more important. In the school system, psychosocial support, counseling and that has completely collapsed for learners. And more we're hearing reports from mental health experts saying that one of the things that people do not realize sufficiently is how this lockdown has affected the mental state of all of us, and particularly children. Therefore, they need even more psychosocial support, which they aren't easily able to get, because the school system is not available. And then also a group that's been very badly neglected throughout the history of South African education is learners with disabilities. And I think that's a key point, that unless they're in school, they can't really cope at home, and yet they need enormous care by their parents. And increasingly parents, when businesses have opened, are going back to work in desperation to get some income to keep their families fed. In that situation, children are often left at home with no mind. And that would be very serious for children with disabilities.
And I just add there, Jane, and to the point, what was interesting to note is that the plans and the regulations that we'd reviewed in our research, they were definitely silent on these points. They were not. We could see that the plans had not taken into account properly what needed to be put in place to provide adequate psychosocial support and support for learners with disabilities. I mean, later iterations of those plans started including those aspects, but by no means in a comprehensive way.
Yes.
And that came through very clearly.
Thank you. Now, Katherine, we want to go to this issue of innovation, and I am aware that time is moving on, so and we need to finish by 12:30. So tell us a bit more about innovation and what it does mean, could mean, And could it be implemented in South Africa in the radical way that many people have spoken about?
Thanks, Jane. So yeah, this was really a very core question we had to ask ourselves as researchers, and we sat with this for a long time about what innovation should look like in an unequal education system like South Africa's. And so what we came down to is actually we had to ask ourselves what we meant in terms of that definition of innovation and what is innovation's purpose. And what we ended up with at the end of the day was that innovation at its core is about problem solving. So when one innovates, you have a problem and you're looking at different approaches or refinements to existing tools and processes in order to solve that problem. But one has to respect the context that you find the problem in, work within your parameters. So yeah, that's what we came down to, at the core of that. And where education is concerned, what we realize is that there is no silver bullet solution. There is no one size fits all. And also that innovation doesn't have to be radical to be innovation. I think as well, just in a very general sense, and it is a bit of a generalization now, but when we talk about innovation, we often think of innovation in a disruptive sense. So, typically, in marketing terms, we would think of the Ubers of the world, or I don't know, Mr. Delivery upsetting all the takeaways and so on. But that's one kind of innovation. There are others, and the kind that we need if we're talking about our principles of doing no harm, and especially getting the basics right, we need to start talking about incremental innovation. So little bits at a time. We're dealing with a very complex system, our education system, and there are a lot of dependent problems within that system. And so, we have to deal with them incrementally.
Yes, for me it was very fascinating knowing Christensen's work on disruptive innovation, where he actually explained to researchers and people at one stage, this doesn't mean slam dunk paradigm shift innovation immediately. It can be disruptive if it is a series of incremental changes that take place that then have the combined effect of disrupting the system, the pre-existing system or paradigm. That's very important. Now, how though does this line up with what government, the president, Minister Angie Motshekga, education officials have been talking about in terms of 4IR? This is something that we've been told we need to become, and the schools are moving to coding, etc. So what can we say about that?
Well, again, that conversation, and very not too long ago, I think it was in May, where at a portfolio committee meeting for basic education, one of the members there they were talking about the DBE's annual performance plan, saying that the performance plan needed to be adjusted to account for COVID-19, and that it needed to be more flexible and adjustments needed to be made. But the three things would remain unchanged. One was that learners would, by a certain date, all be receiving tablets. And the second was that robotics and coding would certainly form part of the curriculum in the new year. And there was a third one relating to different streams of schooling. But those two very clearly falling inside the scope of the DBE's talk of the fourth industrial revolution. It's been all about tablets and building skills for the 21st century and digitizing education and learning. And that conversation, whilst in and of itself, is not particularly harmful. It is harmful in that it's not taking into account all these other things that we've discussed. What good would tablets do if children in grade 4 can't read with comprehension? What good will they do if outside of the classroom that same learner isn't able to go use a toilet safely and without endangering their health and their lives? And I think Jonathan Jansen makes this point in a piece of writing where he's saying that the minister must stop being distracted by this tablet rhetoric. Every second, word coming out of her mouth is there are tablets and we're going online. And it's a little bit misguided in light of the broader conversation that needs to happen. And what really needs to happen is that there should be a proper prioritization. We're not suggesting that South Africa never move in that direction and that it doesn't ever ready itself and try and catch up with technological advancements all around the world. And that at some point things may well become more digital and we may well be able to learn on tablets, but we're not there. We're very, very far away from that. So that kind of terminology and the use of, and the minister's been very clear in certain of her statements that she is talking about disruptive technology in a way that implies that she's suggesting that it will change everything. Just this morning, I saw a newspaper article talking about how much money had been spent in the Eastern Cape on tablets. I mean, there's a separate question or a separate discussion that needs to be had there about how those things were procured and the like. But really, at this point, it seems a little bit misguided to me in the absence of these broader discussions.
Right. Now, are there any? Yes, Katherine, were you wanting to come in? Katherine?
No, that wasn't me, Jane.
That wasn't you. Okay. Well, I think for me, if I could just say some of the key observations that hit me are really how difficult this whole situation of COVID-19 is for its schooling at the moment. And that also places government and all the actors in an incredibly difficult position because instead of being the great leveler, COVID-19, as people suggested initially, they said, well, it can attack anyone. A class has nothing to do with it. Race has nothing to do with it. And it will be the great leveler. Now we're realizing more and more it's the great magnifier of existing inequalities in particular. So what are some of the other research findings that we have come across from current research papers? Is that something you'd like to talk about, Katherine? The difficulties, for instance, we found in any system adapting to abrupt change, and particularly the teachers adapting to abrupt change.
Absolutely. So I think the first thing I want to sort of reflect on is that it's not to diminish the research that we've done, but it really is the product of all the research that came before it. I mean, really, there's absolutely reams and reams of work that came out while we were busy writing this paper. So it really is like a cumulative piece of work, and also, all the inputs of the other eight researchers, doing my maths, that contributed to this. So the findings do match what is out there. So, our findings, form another voice among the many, hopefully giving weight to some of these recommendations and so on. And what we found with the desktop, we had desktop research and then obviously our survey findings. From our survey findings specifically, those do match what we've seen in other papers. There was this big difficulty adapting to the change for teachers, learners, and parents, all having to shift online. Those were the way that were able to. Found that very difficult. There was a lot of stress about completing the curriculum. That whole debate about whether or not the school year could be salvaged and all of that. There were concerns, obviously, about school reopenings, health and safety of teachers for themselves, learners for themselves and their families. And then obviously just general concerns about the effect of COVID-19, obviously in the home, in terms of food security, in terms of job losses and income. And then I think, as both Jane and Rubeena mentioned earlier, there's this unproductive learning environments. Children may be at home with their siblings and extended family, may have lots of chores and things to do. That was one of the things that came out of the findings. And then last year, a sort of a lack of communication and certainty around when the schools would be opening, sort of where everyone is positioned on that continuum. And I know that the three of us had a very frantic Sunday morning call. After the minister announced the schools would no longer be reopening, and there was some very rapid shifting that happened in this paper of ours as we were going along. So we were also subject to that. But from the survey findings, I think the major thing that really stood out was that even though we surveyed more affluent learners, teachers, and parents, the primary thing that came out of there is that the teachers themselves were not as comfortable using digital learning tools. And so the remote learning issue, and especially moving to online, was a challenge as well. Maybe less of a challenge, but it still remained a challenge. And then in terms of the desktop findings, this is just as much a challenge overseas. I think that's the one thing that struck me for developed countries. So if you think of the US and the UK in particular, I know I'm guilty of this, the assumption that because they are developed nations that sort of things happen smoothly and these seamless transitions, and that's actually not been the case. They've definitely had a smoother transition than we've had in South Africa, but there are always bumps in the road. And I felt it's really important that we remember that, for our own context. We're doing as well as we can, I think, in some of these instances.
Well, I think one of the key things that was quite frightening was, I think it was the vast majority of teachers who said they had never used online learning previously. Now we're dealing with households that could at least access the internet, and we know that's not a great, not a great point, but they could at least do that. And they had never used online learning previously, the teachers. And here my research on teachers over many years comes into play. I don't know whether people realize that the bulk of our teaching force is much older teachers who were poorly educated under apartheid education, and then initial teacher education was very poor and limited. And in fact, our initial teacher education, except for some universities, is still not adequate. So these teachers are older, which means they probably are digital immigrants at best. And many of them, because they're older, probably have comorbidities. And so for them, this whole remote learning is just a huge challenge, too big an ask. So I think we have to understand that. And these are the teachers who are in our schools. And yet the teachers are very scared of going back to the schools because they fear infection. Of course, they could get infection from any other place in society, but the schools, going back to school poses great anxiety for them. So now we get, I think, to the critical issue, Rubeena, on what our recommendations actually were. How did we classify the recommendations?
Right. I should also just point out before I get there that importantly, when we're talking about remote learning, what came across very strongly in our research, both in our surveys, but more so in the desktop findings, that we mustn't negate the importance of printed materials in remote learning. And so, we talk about online learning because that seems to be sort of front of mind when people think technology. And we forget that in this country, certainly, not every learner at this moment in time even has access to the basic textbooks that they need. And printed materials are an important element of learning, even remote learning. So I just want to point that out. So our recommendations, as we stated at the beginning, we tried to make them as practical as possible and as relevant at the time of writing, taking into account that, in the short time that it had taken to write the paper and to get it edited and published, that things had moved, exponentially already. But we wanted to make them very, very practical, keeping in mind those guiding principles that we'd actually derived, but really had become apparent to us through the entire research process. And we came up with 4 categories of recommendations, and they're there for everyone to read, but I'll just quickly summarize the 4 categories. One was that, and again, these categories were derived from what came out clearly in our survey findings and our desktop findings, that support is required, and that adequate comprehensive support must be delivered. That includes nutritional support, that includes psychosocial support, and we go into a lot of detail as to what we mean by that. We talk about improving remote learning, and that comes back to the point I made earlier, that and to the points you both have raised, that it requires a number of things. It not only requires that the data divide be closed, but it also requires us to think creatively about what we mean by remote learning, and particularly in this context, so emergency remote teaching that Katherine defined quite early on, the role of other modes of delivery, printed materials being one of them. Something we haven't spoken about, but which was a very important finding, was the role of radio, in particular interactive radio, which had shown in other countries a lot of success because of the penetration of radio. But even in this country, it had shown success when it was rolled out, you must correct me if I'm wrong, Katherine, but 17 years ago, or was it for 17 years, and had been quite successful. But for some reason was just not something that was kept up. And interactive radio just means introducing interactive elements. So listening to the radio, but having learning activities that accompany that, and having that interactive element brought in. The third one was undertaking strategic planning. So the three things were planning, implementation, and monitoring, which is, I admit, quite high level, but when you read the details of the recommendations that we've made, what we're trying to say there is that really these principles that we're talking about and these considerations that we've made must inform the planning, must inform the protocols that government develop in order to address measures of COVID-19. And without taking those into account, without bringing it into the design of these policies and plans, they're going to fail at the outset. Once they are developed, and I should say existing policies as well that currently exist to address these things, including like norms and standards for school infrastructure, which exists, which is law, they should be implemented. And this is not a novel concept at all, and it's a criticism that always gets leveled at us as a country, that we have great policies but can't implement them. And really, we need to think about why they're not being implemented. It's holding us back. It's stopping us from progressing, up the ladder of doing things better, because until you get the basics right, there is no opportunity to do things better. And monitoring the implementation of that. And then finally, really identifying innovative policies and practices for the short term, medium term, and long term. And that means really reflecting, taking stock on what we've learned during this crisis, locally, but also what we've learned from other countries, best practices that we've seen can be adapted, and really reflecting on what can be translated into workable solutions within the context that we've just outlined. But really, in that way, capitalizing on the opportunity, not immediately going to sort of what is the most disruptive way I can shift the paradigm, but taking the opportunity to say, let's see what's worked, let's see what hasn't worked, and to be honest about what can work in this context.
I think it's important to note that within South Africa now, there are better resourced schools, there are NGOs that are all experimenting with improved ways of reaching children, making the learning more effective. And that here in South Africa, there's probably a great need for these attempts and that are successful to be published, put in the public domain, shared in professional learning communities of practice. So I think the report is now about 56 pages, but you can turn to the bit right at the towards the end, where we expand on these four things: deliver comprehensive support, improve remote learning, undertake strategic planning, implementation, and monitoring. What government does needs to be put into a strategic look at what's going to happen, not just now, but what's going to happen next year to schooling, what can be done. So it needs a good major strategic plan, checking that it is being implemented by monitoring all the time, and then identifying those innovative policies and practices that we can implement in the short term, but which cumulatively could bring about significant change in the longer term. So what do we think are the implications of this research for education? We've talked about the three main principles. Do no harm, get the basics right, and ultimately build back better. And it is those innovations, the things that we can learn in these dire times, that can systematically help us to build back better. And the urgency and the emergency that COVID-19 represents for schooling means that to make schools safe, those issues that have been long-standing, insecure school buildings, pit toilets, lack of classroom space, dilapidated buildings, no water, all of those, the spotlight is on them now. So this is the time where I think they have to be addressed for schooling in any way to recommence in a face-to-face way. What final remarks would you like to make, Katherine and Rubeena?
Thanks, Jane and Rubeena. Before that, I think both of you've summed this up so beautifully. For me, again, just to reiterate, it really is that factor of getting the basics right. Again, as you said, COVID-19 is the magnifier, and what we've seen happen, obviously, is all these issues worsen. They were pre-existing issues. One thing that's been springing to mind now is the lack of textbooks. Rubina's right, we didn't touch on the printed materials element, but that is a basic thing. And that's also why we've tried our best to keep our recommendations as practical and as implementable as possible. What can be done on a Monday morning? Print the textbooks, hand them out. You know, that kind of thing. So definitely for me, the focus is on the basics, and then to use, you know, once those basics are in place, to use that as a scaffolding and build that bridge where we can between those two education systems.
I think we're about to run out of time. Thanks, Katherine. But Rubeena, what would your final remarks be?
Yes, I'm agreed with everything that everyone said and summed up very beautifully. I would just add that, just to reiterate something you said earlier on, Jane, that it is a very complex issue, and you know that we expect government to pull out these perfect solutions is not reasonable and not practical. But existing capacity is there, and the importance of partnerships between governments, NGOs, civil society is important, and we should use this opportunity to really sort of combine those capacities and come up with these solutions together, I think.
Very good point. If I reflect, two big things have struck me on after finishing the report, in fact. You know, you've always got to look. Well, according to Rawls, the famous moral philosopher, he proposed this notion of distributive justice, which is the notion of justice and fairness. And he therefore says that any inequalities in a society must favor the least well-off in society. And for me, this research has reinforced that they are the young Black children in poverty-stricken households and communities without reliable or affordable access to the internet, especially therefore in rural communities. And in line with what you've said, Rubeena, the key thing is, and again, going back in my research history, that government, education departments, schooling stakeholders are really, and all of us are confronting what is called a wicked problem. And a wicked problem is not a tame problem that offers a neat solution tomorrow. A wicked problem is something that arises from unanticipated, changing, uncertain causes. It involves great disagreement amongst the stakeholders. We know about that. It involves significant expenditure in the process, a lack of progress being made in this, dealing with this wicked problem, and it does not have a right or wrong answer, only better or worse, good or bad answers. So it because it can't be neatly solved, it has to be managed effectively, doing the least harm and tipping the scales towards the benefit of the least advantaged. This, I believe, should be uppermost in policies and decision-making as we go forward. I think it's time to sign off. So thank you all. Thank you to the listeners. We hope we've persuaded you to read our report or at least delve into it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jane.
Thanks.